Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on Hamas statistics. Are they true or false? The Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health figures have acquired a central importance in international discussions of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. They are repeated by media outlets, often without qualification, and they're continually used as a basis for allegations against Israel of genocide or disproportionate conduct. Now, every right-thinking individual will be deeply disturbed by the thought of the loss of any innocent life. Has that concern been weaponized in the propaganda war of Hamas against Gaza? Yes, of course. But what are we to make of the readiness with which the fatality and casualty statistics have been parroted? And what does an informed analysis of those figures really tell us? A number of statistical analyses have been published indicating the figures are not true, including in March an article in Fathom Journal, Statistically Impossible, a critical analysis of Hamas's women and children casualty figures by Professors Tom Simpson, Lewi and Gregory Rose. I'm delighted to introduce two authors of that article, Professor Lewi and Professor Greg Rose, to discuss their examination of the stats. Professor Stone is a Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University and currently Professor of Maths at RMIT University, Melbourne. He has decades of experience as a mathematical biologist and population modeler with strong interests in statistics and multidisciplinary research. This includes digital humanities and quantifying warfare. Professor Rose is Professor of Law and Chair of the Academic Senate at the University of Wollongong, Australia. He's conducted Australian government projects on detention operations and counter-terrorism legal training, and United Nations projects on implementation of international environmental law. He teaches international law of the sea and maritime regulation and enforcement, and has published on the regulation of counter-terrorism and political violence, particularly the handling and transfer in international military operations of detainees and international legal cooperation for law enforcement in the area of national security. I'm thrilled to have you both with us, a strong Australian contingent on this webinar, which is particularly apt for me as I'll be travelling to your beautiful country later this week. You're both very welcome. Greg, may I invite you to begin presenting your analysis, as I also invite our audience to put their questions into the Q&A facility for us to address after your remarks.
Thank you to UKLFI for inviting us to address your webinar today. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you'll be able to follow easily from there. So the paper that we wrote was called Statistically Impossible, a critical analysis of Hamas's women and children casualty figures, and today's webinar is based upon that. The three authors, Professor Lewi and I, comprise two of them, and Dr. Tom Simpson, an economist and mathematical modeler, is hopefully able to be online tonight and did a wonderful job on the paper, and we remain very much grateful for his excellent work. We're going to look at the Hamas data set. So this talk is based upon Hamas's own figures as released in its reports through the Ministry of Health, and we'll analyze them. There seem to be two phases in the data reliability: the first 3 weeks of the war, and then following the commencement of the ground operation and the collapse of the reporting system, a decline in reliability. We identify various inconsistencies in the Hamas data sets and draw conclusions as to why these might be, what parts of the data were impossible, were they deliberately manipulated, what are the actual casualties, and what are the humanitarian law implications. The kinetic war is accompanied by a data war. So we have wars in the courtroom, lawfare wars, and we also have data wars for and against Israel, with proponents and antagonists for Israel facing off in ad hoc formations, of which we form a part. So now I'll pass across to Lewi, who is going to take us through the mathematical analysis, which I've learned a lot from, but still find extremely daunting. Thank you, Lewi.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest in this subject. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hello? Good, thank you. Hamas attacked Israel at 6:30 a.m. on Saturday morning of October the 7th. Israel responded the same day and for the next 3 weeks was involved in intense airstrikes over Gaza. We call these 3 weeks Phase 1. The Israeli government almost immediately formally declared war with their stated mission to simultaneously destroy Hamas, including all its leaders, and to return home the hostages. Next slide, please. During the 3 weeks of intense air attacks of Hamas, the world media was constantly reporting that there was vast, indiscriminate killing of civilians all the time. But was it really true? The IDF, the Israel Defense Force, always claimed that it expends much effort to keep civilian casualties to a minimum. It is easy to see, though, that most of the attacks were highly targeted and far from indiscriminate and random. Firstly, Israeli intelligence had Gaza very well mapped out. From earlier wars, we can see the fine detail that Israeli intelligence had on hand and was constantly building up. So here is Operation Protective Edge in 2014. You see, somehow you don't see the legend there, Greg, but there you do. So operatives are marked out, tunnels are marked out, launching sites are marked out. They know where everything is. Next slide, please. So the IDF's goal of next slide, please, Greg. The IDF's goal of eliminating Hamas was first and foremost viewed as eliminating its political leaders, its commanders, neutralizing its military brigades. All of these were considered legitimate activities in the eyes of the IDF. So what I want to show you now, you won't see it anywhere else, but we have shown that an unusual proportion of the Phase 1 Air Force bombings were closely associated with well-defined targets associated with Hamas. So from Saturday midnight of October 7, and in a space of less than 9 hours, 11 of the most senior leaders in Hamas, including 3 Politburo members or their residences, were successfully pinpointed and targeted. This table that we've compiled lists about 30 senior leaders and commanders that were targeted by airstrikes in the first 3 days. These individuals make up a who's who of VIP Hamas terrorists. From, for example, the officers of Yahya Sinwar, the most senior leader of Hamas. They were there at midnight on Saturday. The legendary military leader Mohammed Daif the next day, down to the head of the Ministry of Shahids, the Ministry of Martyrs. In less than 2 weeks, some 13 of the 18 most senior leaders of Hamas had been targeted in some manner or other, or had been neutralized through airstrikes. At least 5 of them were killed. So this obviously gives the evidence of this amazing ability of the IDF to carry out targeted airstrikes on Hamas leaders in such a short span of time with a degree of precision that's pretty overwhelming. Now, Greg is going to return back to this idea of targeting and intent. Meanwhile, next slide, please, Greg. So now I'm going to turn to the mortality data, which is the main interest of today, and that is the record of the deaths over the last 6 months in Gaza. So the Gazan Ministry of Health, which is officially in charge of registering all mortality data, it's tightly controlled by Hamas leaders. Now, this was known in the past, but proven again and again during the current war. It's established that Hamas also controlled the data being served out to the world. So here is a typical sheet of the register that they collect showing names, ID numbers. They give the ID numbers, age, and gender. Okay, and we're going to start with this phase one, when it's the period when the data was the most reliable. Next slide, please, Greg. And here you see on the left is the Ministry of Health report of October 26, 3 weeks, the first report, 3 weeks after the war started. And on the right, you see that United Nations is also putting out data. United Nations tries to mirror the data of the Ministry of Health. It follows it fairly well in most periods. And that's usually what the media relies on when it publishes statements. Okay, next slide, please. So United Nations is a derivative report from the Ministry of Health. Greg, next slide. Good. So now I'm going to just touch on the key statistics that we're interested in. Firstly, how many died, but cumulatively. So it's updated every day. So on the left, on the top left, you see a graph of the BBC, and you see that at the beginning of the war, there were none dead. And by the 5th of April, there are more than 32,000 dead. And the curve below it shows the number of children and women dead. Yeah, that's the one. And you see that the children and women are something like 70% of the total number from the BBC curve. Now, I want you to look at this. It might make you think about the women and children statistics differently. Let W be the proportion of women, or the adult women amongst the dead. Let M be the proportion of dead adult men, and let C be the proportion of dead children amongst the Gazan dead. Okay, so in the Gazan population, the women are 25% of the population, the children are 50% of the population, and the men are 25% of the population. It works like that there. That's how it divides up, unusually. Or not that unusually. So already the proportion of women and children are 75%. So if there is indiscriminate bombing and killing of civilians, you would expect women and children to have a proportion of 75% amongst the dead. Okay. Now, so we have women plus children plus men in proportions add to 1. So let's rearrange that. We see women plus children is 1 minus M. I think we can sort of follow that. So what would happen if the number of men were deliberately not disclosed? The women and children would just jump up, right? So, Greg, why don't we move to the next page? So here we see in the 2014 war, it was policy not to disclose details of terrorist operatives that killed during the war. And it wasn't just the last war. And it also seems to be going on in this war too. So publishing data about the fallen is not a good idea. So it might compromise the morale of the troops. It might give Israel information that it doesn't want to have. And it's not good for propaganda purposes. So this Facebook message you see here was published on the Ministry of Interior's website. Don't leak information about dead terrorists or dead operatives. Who's an operative in Hamas? It can be even a child, actually. Many over the age of 18 operatives. So let's move to the next slide, please. Now, we've been staring at the data for a long time, but the first alarm bells when we looked at this UN data, and Salo Eisenberg found this amazing thing. Here's 2 dates, 25th of October and 26th of October. Let's look at the total number of dead. There's 6,547 fatalities on the 25th of October and 7,028 on the 26th of October. How many died in 24 hours? That's, Greg, in the middle T is 7,028 minus 6,547. There are 481 fatalities in 24 hours. Okay, how many women died? There's 417 women who died in 24 hours. How many children died? There's 209 children that died. So let's add up the women and children. There are 626 women and children that died in this 24 hours. How many fatalities were there? 481. So how can that be that there were more women and children dead than there were fatalities? By far. Like 30 or so percent more. So obviously that's wrong. There's some error or fraud. We don't know what it is, but obviously you can't have more women and children deaths than total deaths. There are other reasons that could be there. There are all sorts of reasons, but it happens so often, all these weird things popping up that just didn't make sense, that shouldn't be there. No legitimate register of data should be doing this stuff. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So then at the end of phase one, in November, data scientists for the social good rush in because there's all this group of data scientists that are waiting for a war to happen to try out their data toys on them. So Lancet published straight away, as soon as they could, 2 pieces on the data, and the one on the right, around that time there are a lot of people in the Israel camp that were saying that Hamas data was inflated, that there were more deaths than were happening than were being sorry, that I got that back to front. Sorry, Hamas was reporting more deaths than there actually were. So, this group here tried to look for evidence of inflation in the mortality data. So you see, they did that by comparing the red line, which is the Gazan mortality data, to the blue line, which is UNRWA staff deaths. And their whole idea was to show that the Gazan mortality was less in intensity than UNRWA. So back again, Greg, please. You back to the Greg, please back. Yeah. So the problem here is their whole methodology is flawed. If you gave it inflated data, it would not even find it. And as statisticians has proven that rigorously. Anyhow, on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please, Greg. Thank you. So here's an important stage of the war. On October 26th, the ground forces enter. That means the IDF didn't have to worry or could stop with all the air bombings, which they have less fine control over targeting, and bring the ground forces in, and they could reduce harming civilians. So the idea was this should really bring down the civilian casualties, which is what IDF wants to do. So in this period, though, the Al-Shifa hospital was one of the first centers to be investigated because that was a nerve center for Hamas. And they found there were long suspicions about that happening. It so happened that the doctors were on the run, and the doctors were questioned with their connections for Hamas. And in the process, because of the chaos, the whole data entry system collapsed. So as Al-Qidra said, the electronic database that health authorities use to compile casualties from hospitals is no longer able to count the names and tally the statistics. So we have a period in time when the data is really unreliable. Doesn't matter whose fault or whatever, for whatever reason, it's just not reliable in this period. And there are gaps and breaks and sub-phases within the next months. Next slide, please, Greg. Now, for example, and here's this is the kind of thing we're seeing again and again. December the 1st to December the 8th, it's like 7 or 8 days here. Now, as I said in the beginning, when you're looking at cumulative deaths per day, they have to increase because they can either stay the same or increase because they're being updated every day. They cannot decrease. Here we're plotting the number of Hamas men. We have that. These are direct statistics from the Ministry of Health. And between December 1st and December 8th, they're decreasing, not by 5, not by 10, but by 1,000 over 8 days. Given that there's only 5,000 of them, that's a huge amount. So that's obviously just impossible. And as a consequence, when the men are decreasing, the proportion of women and children must increase. So you see this other graph here, which shows that the proportion of women and children increased from 66% up to 80%. Totally crazy things are occurring in the data. The only way that if we go to that black line showing the decrease in men, there is only one way that the cumulative number can decrease, and that is if Hamas terrorists are resurrecting, which probably is not happening. So let's move to the next slide, please, Greg. Okay, now I want to focus a little more on this 70% figure of women and children, which was being reported in all the press everywhere at all times. Next slide, Greg. So we were forced to look at all the Gaza Ministry of Health reports, and they started publishing them in December last year, a little bit more regularly. And every one of them, we saw this, none of us speak Arabic, so we had to put it through the Google Translate ringer or the Deep AI ringer. And we see 70% of that figure in red, 70% appearing everywhere. So when we translated it, it's telling us in every single report, whether or not it's true that the women and children reach 70%, that 70% of women and children were killed in the dead. And it's like a trademark of every report or a stamp on it almost. The numbers changed, but the 70% didn't. And you can see all the 9 reports. So alarm bells again. So we looked, with each alarm bell, we looked closer and closer. So please, next slide, Greg. Okay. Even in one of the reports, it said 70% dead and gave some figures to make you believe that it's 70% dead. But when you looked at one of the graphs, it showed that if you look at registered hospital deaths, there were 58% dead. 58% women and children dead amongst the dead. So that made us really think, what's going on here? How could 58% appear when they're saying it's 70%? And then we had to understand, what are these registered deaths? So this was a new thing for us. So please, next slide, Greg. Greg? Okay, so let me explain. Here's the from one of the reports. Here's the typical statistics you get. On the top, you see 30,228 total deaths. Greg? Yeah. And you see, and then you see the 17,285 in the purple at the bottom. Greg? In the purple, you see 17,285 hospital deaths. And then coming back to the middle, the top, you see 12,943 unregistered deaths. What are they? So it turns out that the 17,285 deaths, they're proper registered deaths where they have all the details, the ID numbers, the names, and the age, the birth date, rather. The 12,943, there's no details available on them. They're just not available. I don't even believe they have them. So that's 43% of the deaths that they're feeding the media. We know nothing about them, and they don't either. Next page, please. Oh, wait. On the top left, you see the deaths come from reliable media sources. Okay, so all they say is the number of deaths come from the reliable media sources, whatever they are. And a newspaper interviewer put the head of the ministry on the spot and asked him, where do they come from? And he said they don't really know. They can't really tell. So we get this, this is what we broke in March, that the Gaza ministry can't provide names for more than 10,000, in this case it was 13,000, of those it says it have died, which is terrible. This is not a proper death registry. Okay, next slide. Wait. So the other thing is that in that period, back again, Greg, in that period, people were registering deaths by Google Doc notices and all sorts of things. The bodies weren't seen. They just put in a Google Doc notice and that could be a death. That's the media. That's the type of media source that it is. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Now, let's probe a little bit further. Let's restrict just for convenience, let's restrict the analysis to 2024 registered deaths. These are the ones we know about. We look at the women and children deaths and it comes to something like 42%. Okay, so that should be a guide of what the proportion women and children deaths is, 42%. But in the end, it's based on Hamas data and therefore subject to all the problems of that data. 42% is still a large problem, but it should be remembered that women and children make up 75% of Gaza's population. So the 42% reflects the IDF's significant avoidance of civilian casualties. Next slide, please, Greg. Greg? Okay, so here I just want to say some final words about the media source data. We were able to reverse engineer it and see what is inside of it. You can do that by messing with the data a little bit, but the bottom line is that when we manipulated the data sets and we knew the registered hospital deaths and we knew the total deaths, so by subtracting the two, you should be able to find something about the unregistered deaths. We had a few different ways of doing it. So what we found on the right-hand graph is that for the month of December, say, there were hardly any men. There was 99% women and children and 1% men by reverse engineering. It's very strange because these media deaths or these unregistered deaths were for the northern, that if they represent anything, it should be northern Gaza where a lot of the fighting was going on in December. And so the people that would have been dying should have been the combat soldiers and not women and children. The women and children shouldn't be in sight probably. And but yet there are no men there. So it's very unusual. Okay, and the schematic here is if you have registered deaths of 58%, say, and unregistered of 99%, and you mix them together, no wonder you get 70% coming out in your report. Of course, you can adjust the 99% to make sure you get the 70%. Next slide, please, Greg. Okay, so that's more or less what I wanted to say. I just finished by showing what the data can say many other things about the progress of the war. If we just plot cumulative deaths over the first 4 or 5 months, you see that the first 3 weeks it's going at one slope quite intensely, and then it slows down after that. The slope is almost half of what it was. Or the right-hand side, you can see there's about 300 casualties per day in the first few weeks. And then in the last few weeks of that graph, it's down to a half of that. So the war considerably slowed down. I don't know if anyone in the media noticed it. Well, fortunately, the New York Times did put out an article, but it went very quiet. And then it's slowed down even more. I'm going to put it over to Greg now. Thank you very much for your interest in this subject.
Thank you, Lewi. What conclusions do we draw from this analysis of the data? Well, the most obvious, top level one, is that the total number and the civilian casualties within that number may not be accurate. That the registered deaths for which identities are available account for only 2/3 of the purported total deaths. And it is clear through the impossibility, to the best of our knowledge, of any new technologies that make resurrection to life a commonplace norm, that in fact data sets were falsified and mixed into the hospital data. So not just for the media report or Google Doc incomplete data, but even in the hospital data, false figures were given for the total deaths of women and children in many periods during the mortality surveillance conducted by the Ministry of Health. And that therefore the proportion of civilians killed was less than 70%, the headline figure that the Ministry of Health provided. And once you looked at its own data, you find that it's closer to 40%, particularly over the last 5 months. We see a decline in the proportion of civilians to the extent that women and children represent civilians and can be used as an indicator of non-combatants. The data exhibits statistically impossible behavior, so one can apply statistical mathematical rules that demonstrate nonsenses are embedded in the data. And the impact of this on the cumulative data over the progression of the war is that it renders the whole of the data unreliable because the faults are embedded throughout. So the Gazan Ministry of Health mortality surveillance methods were unreliable, and the flaws or unreliability seem to have been used to advantage in order to skew the data to convey a particular narrative. And that narrative is calculated disinformation. Data warfare is a very important part of the war effort. Just like psychological operations, it is in fact a kind of wartime psychological operation, as I'll explain further. It's difficult to prove that the data is deliberately manipulated rather than merely erroneous due to circumstances, but certainly the circumstances are suspicious in that they consistently hide the proportion of men who are likely to embody greater numbers and proportions of combatants, and inflate the numbers of women and children who are likely to embody a greater number of civilians, thus skewing the data towards civilian deaths. And if at presently the Gazan deaths attributed to Israel are 33,000, they're likely themselves to be inflated by over 10,000, because the natural rate of death of about 3.5 per 1,000 per year in Gaza across 6 months for 2.5 million people gives you 4,000 naturally occurring deaths, which are included in the total deaths in Gaza and apparently attributed to Israel. Israel itself, the IDF losses of its soldiers are about 20% attributable to friendly fire. And Hamas friendly fire or misfire of rockets, we know that 15% of all Hamas and Islamic Jihad rockets landed in Gaza. Plus, there have been numerous violent repressive acts, including the shooting of civilians who were fleeing from their positions as civilian shields when they were desired to by Hamas to remain in position as shields, or where they were attempting to seize food from convoys, which Hamas wished to seize. There have been multiple recorded instances of Hamas firing on Gazan civilians. So you've got natural deaths, misfire or friendly fire, and deliberate fire on civilians that should be deducted from the total attributable to Israel. So that's in relation to the total figure that you would take from 33,000 down by at least 10,000, conservatively speaking. And then the proportion of civilians within the number of people killed is also likely inflated, as we've seen in the analysis that Lewi described. And we'll have opportunity during the discussion to go into some of the complexities in more detail. But it should be noted that if 33,000 is reduced to 10,000 and the IDF says it has eliminated 13,000 combatants, that leaves you with a relative minority of civilians that are incidentally and accidentally killed by the Israeli military operations. We'll maybe talk a little bit about the comparison of UNRWA staff data later, and it should be remembered that just as we see many terrorist attacks conducted by minors in Israel and in Australia, the same is also true in Gaza. So not all children are non-combatants, even if they're used as an analogy or sampler for non-combatants. So what are the international humanitarian law implications of this? IHL implications embody the principles of necessity, discrimination, precaution, and proportionality, where necessity is the principle of targeting only military goals that provide a military advantage. Discriminating, meaning distinguishing between military and civilian objects and protecting civilian objects. Precaution, using intelligence, warnings, proper munitions, and safety measures to protect civilians and civilian objects. And proportionality, the use of military force and types of munitions that do not cause excessive damage relative to the military advantage to be gained. So is Israel in breach of these principles? It certainly is if harm caused by the Israel Defense Forces to Gazan civilians is intentional rather than merely incidental or accidental in the fog of war. If it's intentional, then Israel stands accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or in really large-scale circumstances of genocide. And certainly that's the narrative that Hamas seeks to convey and portray, to implicate Israel falsely as intentionally targeting civilians, causing disproportionate harm to civilians, and systematically destroying civilian infrastructure. Yet it's actually Hamas which is deliberately embedded into the urban environment, using the civilian population as a defense, as a strategic equivalent of defensive fortifications. And on the other hand, in reality, you have Israel exerting its best efforts to avoid civilians through precision targeting, guided munitions, real-time intelligence used to abort operations where civilians are identified as being at excessive risk, use of warnings to civilians to evacuate, the provision of evacuation and refuge areas, all of which negate the implication that Hamas is conveying through its narrative of intention to harm civilians. So in fact, data analysis, when we go into the reports, tells a truer story than the Hamas narrative that's adopted by the media such as the BBC, NPR, The Guardian, and of course UN agencies like the UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency, and the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We see instead that women and children comprise approximately 40% of casualties based on Hamas's own data. not 75% as they would be if the damage that was being caused was indiscriminate, nor Hamas's constant claim of a constant 70%. We see also then that the civilian to combatant death rate, where we include men who are a proportion of whom are innocent bystanders, is somewhere between 1:1 and 1.5:1 civilians to combatants, which is an extraordinarily highly targeted and precise and contained strike rate, far less lethal in a general sense than the contemporary global rate in urban warfare of 9 civilians to every 1 combatant. And finally, we see that the civilian death rate doesn't prima facie support Hamas's claims that Israel is committing criminal acts in breach of the laws of warfare, but rather is prima facie in compliance with the principles of international humanitarian law. So just to finish up then, the disinformation that's provided through the data sets distributed by the Ministry of Health have a clear wartime purpose. They are part of psychological operations, part of the grey zone in strategic warfare, in which lawfare plays a part, delegitimizing Israel's right of self-defense through international legal processes, and a lot of other Ds like demoralizing troops, defunding Israeli efforts and investments by foreign companies, disconnecting suppliers along the logistics supply chains, and distracting attention from the right of self-defense that Israel is executing. And this is mobilized through mass media and social media, such that the war is in fact being won by the IDF in Gaza, but lost worldwide in hearts and minds. So that brings us to the conclusion of the presentation, Natasha, and Lewi and I and Tom, thank you for this opportunity to share the work that we published in the Fathom Journal.
Well, Greg, Lewi, thank you ever so much. There have been so many comments commending you on this detailed analysis and also lamenting the fact that it hasn't as yet engaged a wider audience. And perhaps we'll come on to some of your thoughts on that in due course, and what it is that you may be doing to get this important information out and circulated. I've had quite a few questions on the technical aspects of this coming through, which I'll also attempt to put to you. But can I begin with some questions on the categorization of the numbers as you've been looking at them? Have you seen any consistent definition of children in this respect? We've had questions about the age, whether that includes, of course, teenage combatants. You've made some references to children, perhaps also, unfortunately, falling into the combatant categories here. That would probably reflect some female casualties also. But how have you seen those sorts of issues, if you've seen them at all, reflected in the data that you've been investigating?
Well, Lewi, do you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, part of it. So first of all, our analysis was done to conform with other analyses that how the BBC does it, how everyone else is doing it, to make the comparison valid. And children are usually taken to be 18 years or under, or just under 18. So we do it both ways. Yeah, so I think that's sufficient for our analysis. Now we do see evidence that between 14 and above, that there seems to be a little bit more activity in the male children, but we're not really getting into that. So I'm not sure why whether there's any other question behind that.
Well, you've mentioned.
In short, we follow standard for our analysis. We follow the standard definitions.
Understood. And you've mentioned reporting and analysis in other areas. One of the questions asked is, do we have comparative reporting methods and methods of objectively collecting data in other combat regions such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, which could demonstrate what a reliable and objective method of reporting casualties would entail? Are you aware of how these issues have been dealt with elsewhere, and has that impacted your approach here?
Well, I might give that a start, Lewi. Would that be all right?
Sure.
The data that comes out of Gaza is actually relatively detailed and extensive. Oops, light always goes out here. Compared to Ukraine, compared to Afghanistan, compared to Iraq, where the data is in fact far more patchy because the propaganda machine that operates in Gaza and in the West Bank is very sophisticated and extensive. So they had the data collection and distribution system running for over a decade out of Shifa Hospital and coordinated with other hospitals. So they were actually in a much stronger position to assemble and distribute data than has been the case in other wars, where the estimates of the lower and the upper bound can be quite huge, can be 100, 150,000 people uncertain.
Understood. Lewi, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
No, that's...
Perhaps I could put in that case a couple of the questions on the reverse engineering approach that you've described. You've based that on the idea that the overall figure is made of the sum of data coming from two independent, non-overlapping sources. And the questioner asks, is that credible? Is this stated clearly in the Ministry of Health reports? I want to come on to where the media reports might be generating their data from, but do you have anything specifically to?
Yeah, I even showed that in a slide.
Yeah.
Should we go back to the slide or the purple slide, the one with the figures? I showed that there's registered deaths of 17,000. And I forget what it was, another 7,000 of unregistered, and then they add them together to get the total. So it's imprinted there in the report for everyone to see in all of their reports the same way. It's very surprising. We had to work that out, sort of thing, because it was all in Arabic, but that's what they're doing.
And in terms of where they're generating the data from, outside of the Ministry of Health statistics that are hospital records, and you indicated that they have a great deal more detail, or at least detail on the individuals that have been processed. There are reports that the other sources are in part based on Google documents that are being circulated to the general population, asking ordinary people to list their martyrs and include lists of individuals that they attribute to the civilian casualties or the death toll here. Have you, I don't want to ask you to speculate, but have you seen any information as to what is informing those non-Ministry of Health reports?
Yeah, so they say in the report, the Ministry of Health report, they hint at what's happening, and they say, all right, the hospitals in the centre and the south are functioning and they can keep up with the registering, but the hospitals in the north are on the state of collapse and they cannot do that, and there's communications breakdown. They have the numbers, all they can do is phone it and send a number into Al-Shifa. So that may or may not, I mean, that could well be true, and maybe they're real numbers, but we don't know after that, whether they're women or children. That's up to the people in Al-Shifa to decide if they so want, you know. So these there's a collapse. So in short, there's a collapse of the northern hospitals. The numbers are meant to be representative of them. Okay. There are these Google forms. I've heard about it, that the population's being asked to submit any martyrs and they'll be incorporated. I don't know much more than that. Maybe Greg does.
There has been analysis of the data sets that have been created that have identified people with the same ID numbers repeated 8 times. So there are many inconsistencies. ID numbers that are non-existent or impossible ID numbers within the Gaza ID number system. Many inconsistencies in the registered data.
Wait, so the first report on April the 26th, the data didn't have that problem. The data was done well. So the Lancet article, which had a report of something like 6,000 or 7,000 deaths, all the ID numbers were consistent. But there was a report released in
April
April.
26.
No,
October
the April
26
report,
you're talking about. Yeah.
October 26, yeah. The April report has a lot of inconsistencies, maybe 10. We're talking about 10% maybe, right, Greg? 10% of the ID numbers are weird.
There was also, of course, you referred to the FDD report in April, some reporting off of the absence of identifying information in what seemed to be well over 10,000, perhaps even 13,000 of the figures that were being claimed by Hamas. The reporting off the back of that report has indicated that Hamas has admitted to these flaws in their data. Do you read it that way, or is it essentially criticism?
I don't know why they said that, but I could imagine. Like I showed you that purple thing, and you see the unregistered deaths are pointed out there. So in that way, they're admitting it. I mean, it's in a way they're stating it to everyone who wants to read the report.
Have you
It's
seen?
not like they came out. It's not like they came out on April and said, "Oh, we actually admit that we." We've been fooling you all. No, they've been telling us all along that they're not including that data.
And working on the basis of the way that these reports have been carrying out over many months now, have you seen any attempt at revisions? There are a couple of questions here about a particular incident on the 17th of October. This is the Al-Ahli Arab Hospital. The original attribution of this by the international media was to an Israeli airstrike that was very quickly debunked, and it was in fact a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short in the Gaza Strip. But some 500 casualties were being claimed while it was suggested that the hospital itself had been struck rather than the car park as ultimately transpired. Have you seen any attempts to revise blatantly incorrect or debunked figures such as those on the 17th of October?
My recollection, it's not my own finding, but Dr. Tom Simpson's finding, and I hope I don't misquote you, Tom, is that the original figure remains in the report without revision.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate, Greg, that you've touched on.
Well, there was a slight revision. There was a slight revision, but I think they brought it. With tens of people. It was reduced by a matter of tens to 100. I can't remember. It's very hard to find out, actually. The problem is that there are intelligence reports that say that 50 people died, and and Hamas claims it was 470. That 470 persists in their numbers. And they probably believe it. The car park there was a number of people in that car park, so it's very hard to know. The fact was that Hamas did revise it slightly, and they do revise their figures. I don't know whether they revise it because they're putting more errors in it or because they want to be more accurate, but you do see signs that it's being revised.
Lewi, I have a question here as to the well, I've just lost it. Forgive me. I'll come back to that. Before we could delve into some of the detail, a number of agencies have claimed that the Hamas death figures have been interrogated and presented as accurate. You've mentioned, of course, the Lancet reports. Human Rights Watch has claimed to provide objective international scrutiny. We've also had references to the BBC verifying Hamas figures. What do you make, and can you respond at all to these suggestions that, in fact, these figures have been verified and that previous figures put out by Hamas in past conflicts have also been found to be accurate?
Just to finish off about Al-Ali, there are some people, Tom included, that think there are only 50 people died. In which case, if he's right, that means there's 400 deaths that have been included that shouldn't be included. Whatever the case, there's 400 deaths that usually gets attributed to Israel. You know, that all goes into the death register, and people say that's part of the 32,000. Now, coming to your question, so when they say that they've interrogated the data, that means that the Lancet report, there's been a Lancet report. It's quite a good report. It's on the first phase. The first phase, the data was looked after carefully. And I have to tell you, in the Al-Ali hospital, they have epidemiologists there that are quite good. You know, they know what they're doing, and they're preparing for this. They know that when there's going to be a war, people are going to look at the data. So they've been preparing for it. So they're not going to do anything too obvious easily. And as soon as Biden expressed doubt in the figures, they put out a huge report in about 2 days. It was amazing how they did that. Anyhow, to really interrogate the data, it needs people that are trained really well to do that. There aren't many such people, and most people don't have time to do it either. You know, it's not something you can do in a few days. It's taken the three of us months and months, like half a year. Yeah. And yeah.
So the BBC fact checker in the Strand in London is not going to be going out into the field and checking the data in depth and identifying corpses and verifying interviews. So what they call a fact check is something that is dubious in the extreme.
Well, they didn't even think to walk down the street and have a look at the Al-Ali hospital on the 17th of October and see that it had not in fact been struck. But I certainly take the point. There's a question here, and I don't normally ask questions I don't understand entirely, but I'm going to give it a go on this one. So please bear with me, gentlemen. Has the trend in death statistics been subject to best curve fitting techniques? It appears that there is a linear fit. Has this been subject to a statistical student team test? Are you able to help with that, Lewi? I'm assuming those are mathematical approaches or terms.
If they're talking about a graph that I showed,
yeah,
there was some regression analysis put on it, yeah, to find that the two slopes are different, significantly different, and they are. So we did a statistical test was done on that, but we didn't work on that too hard because it wasn't our main interest. But yeah, so fitting techniques were done. There are many different types of fitting tests. We did a regression.
I fully appreciate that what you have presented is essentially the tip of the iceberg, that the mathematical analysis that you've applied, and I can see from the comments that it is the first time many people are encountering these sorts of approaches and this sort of analysis. It is critical to show the internal inconsistencies in the figures. But when we zoom out of that, of course, we've got all of the points that Greg concluded with in terms of the cause of death, natural deaths that have been arising Hamas shooting their own civilians, their rockets falling short in the Gaza Strip, and what seems to be figures increasing on a very uniform basis, which, as you've indicated, is statistically impossible in so many respects. Do you, either of you, think that we'll ever have a true assessment of the numbers, or even a realistic estimate of the casualty figures that are perhaps properly attributable to the Israeli military operation?
I would hazard an answer there, Lewi, which is to say the truth will never be known. And that is always the case in a major conflict. I mean, the number of dead, the number of refugees, the number of combatants, the number of civilians are investigated in the coming years and decades, and approximations are reached. That will be the same story here, particularly where there is so much calculated misinformation.
Bearing that
It's
in
going
mind,
to be
sorry, go ahead.
It's going to be very interesting when the IDF decides to make a statement, and they always do analyses, and they have much information that we have no idea about. So nothing can really be said final until the IDF releases statements or information, and they usually do that a few years after the war.
Even the IDF casualty stats that have been released thus far, I think the latest update was in March. They indicated that 13,000 terrorists had been killed in Gaza. The response, unfortunately, at least in the international media, was that that couldn't be right, because the Hamas figures that had been put out and accepted were inconsistent with Israel's figures. I've seen a lot of comments talking about an equivalence between Hamas and Israel that is seemingly been drawn. But in that respect, the Hamas figures that have now been thoroughly debunked are being proffered in order to, it seems, disprove what the IDF is putting out itself. You have both given an extraordinary overview, and I'm extremely grateful to that. If I can conclude perhaps by asking how it is that you're proposing on taking this analysis forward. I fully appreciate that academic publications take many, many months. With the rolling news story that we've had over the last 6 months and these figures being used as a default, there is inevitably a delay to getting the facts, the analysis, and the debunking analysis in particular out there. But there's so much enthusiasm from the comments and the chat to have this important information more widely disseminated. Do you have any proposals or thoughts to achieve that?
Well, the strategies that we've used so far is to have it reported on in the national paper in Australia, to use the global reach of UKLFI, and Fathom. We would like to follow up with an academic version of the Fathom article that can be cited. And this will be one of the volleys in the data wars that are going to follow, or are already commencing during and will continue to follow the conflicts. And any suggestions that your listeners have as to the best ways to promote this material would be gratefully received.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. This is extraordinary and important work, and I'm sure that this will not be the last element of the discussion. So very, very grateful to you both for making the time.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.